And right now, I'd like to bring on the CEO of Cal Nonprofits, Jeff Green, who will be giving us a bit of a rundown about Cal Nonprofits and then introducing our panelists.
Thanks so much, Robert. And good morning, everyone. I'm actually joining you from the road between conferences and all the things happening early in the year, Coalinga and Fresno County. And we're grateful that you're all here. For those of you newer to Cal Nonprofits, just want to give you a couple notes on where we come from and what we're doing. Those of you that are veterans know this. But California Association of Nonprofits, 40 years old now. We're really known primarily for three things. First is our policy and advocacy work. So a lot of what we're doing day in and day out is supporting the sector broadly, doing what we can to make sure that policy is as supportive and positive for our sector, that the ways in which we partner with government are not only respected, but improved as we go along. We're removing barriers. We're making sure that equity and access to resources and all the things that our sector does are in fact reflected back in policy. So we truly believe that nonprofits need to be more, not less, engaged in policy and political work. Obviously, there's the partisan line, but with everything else having to do with how we shape the rules of how we all interact in this community, our society, that we believe that nonprofits have a role to play, not only to be at the table, but to lead in many cases. And so that's what we're here to do. And the way I like to think of that is, can you imagine what our housing policy, what our environmental policy, what our childcare policies would look like if, in fact, the people on the ground in community were leading those conversations rather than responding after the fact? So that's really a big thrust of our work. The second is education, and that's what we're doing right here, having opportunities to bring incredible leaders and speakers and presenters to the breadth of the sector across the vast state of California and beyond, as well as translating what a policy change in Sacramento may mean to the field anywhere in the state of California. And then finally, data and research. And this is the piece that we probably do the least of, but we're often bringing data and research that others do. And today is a great example of that. And to share what others in our sector, our allies and colleagues have learned and are learning, as well as doing our own. And in fact, this year, Causes Count, which some of you are familiar with, will be coming back, and we'll have a 2025 update and expansion of that report. So it's all there in service of our fabulous sector, and we're grateful that you're joining us this morning. So it is my privilege now to introduce our primary speaker and presenter today, and after she has a chance to share some of the wisdom that they've gained at Independent Sector, Dr. Akilah Watkins and I will talk a bit about what this all means when we are looking at the trust that our communities have in our sector. That is, of course, the coin of the realm, as some might say, in an old-timey sense. But our trust of our communities, the fact that we are of, by, and for so many communities across the country and throughout the state of California, really is something we want to spend some time looking at. Independent Sector has done this. This is, I believe, the 5th edition of this particular look at the trust that our communities have and what they do and don't have, and so on and so forth. And I'm going to stop there before I go off the rails and simply pass it to Akilah. Akilah, thank you so much, CEO of Independent Sector. Welcome.
Thank you so much, Jeff, and to your team for facilitating this conversation today. You have been an incredible partner to work with, and the nonprofits of California should be they are incredibly fortunate to have you leading the work for the state. So thank you so much for this humbling invite today. So I would like to just wish everybody a happy new year, and thank you for joining me today. Before I begin, though, I would like to take a moment to acknowledge the devastating recent wildfires in Southern California. Our hearts are with the communities affected and the thousands of nonprofits that have been displaced. We deeply appreciate all the nonprofits working tirelessly to support recovery efforts. Again, thank you, Jeff, and the California Association of Nonprofits, Robert, which I'm proud to say is an Independent Sector member, long time, for inviting me to host today's discussion, Independent Sector's 5th Annual Trust in Nonprofits and Philanthropy Report. Next, Robert. So, here we go. Before we dive into public trust and philanthropy and nonprofits, let me tell you a little bit about Independent Sector. Independent Sector is the only national membership organization and advocate for nonprofits and philanthropy. We help make sure charitable organizations and the people are well-resourced, well-governed, and effective. Because of this, you all are better able to do the important work that you're chartered to do. Next slide. And so we believe a healthy, trusted, and equitable nonprofit sector is essential to a nation where all people can thrive. So let me tell you what we think a healthy sector looks like. We want to see 4 things. We want to see nonprofits that are financially robust. We want to see them powered by a thriving workforce. We want to see them trusted, well-governed, and effective, and informed and active advocates as the law allows. Today, we're going to talk about trust, though. Next slide. Public trust is the currency of the nonprofit sector. Our sector exists because of the public belief that nonprofits will do the right thing. Communities have relied upon nonprofits to provide education, culture, life-sustaining services, environmental stewardships. Think about even when COVID was at the height, a lot of nonprofits had to organize to make sure inoculations were happening in communities, especially hard to hit hardest and most vulnerable communities. In today's highly polarized environment, understanding and managing trust have never been more important. It is imperative that we assess the status of that trust and how our sector can strengthen our most valuable asset. That's why we've partnered with Edelman Data and Intelligence for each of the last 5 years to survey the American public and explore the nuances of trust in the American nonprofit and philanthropic organizations. Our trust surveys are the largest nationally represented surveys of their kind. We also conduct online focus groups to provide richer context for our findings. Today, we're going to review a bit about the report findings, as well as the strengths and challenges that our sector is currently undergoing in 2024. Next. So let's talk a little bit about some of the key findings. After 4 years of decline, and again, thinking about the decline happening within COVID, trust in nonprofits rebounded by 5 points to 57% in 2024. Across nonprofit subsectors, trust continues to remain high, especially in areas such as human services, animals and wildlife, health, and youth development. Trust in other sectors like government, business, and media continue to decline, leaving nonprofits the most trusted sector in our latest survey. When we think about trust in philanthropy, though, we do see a bit of a disparity. Philanthropy is holding steady at about 33%. It is lower than 57% when we think about trust in nonprofits. Trust in private foundations, though, has increased in 2024. Trust in corporate philanthropy and high net worth individuals remain much lower. And we'll get a chance to sort of dig in and talk about some of the why behind this. Americans do trust nonprofits to reduce national divisions more than they trust corporations, government, or media, which is something we should be extremely proud of. While overall trust in nonprofits have recovered, Americans have less trust in nonprofits to advocate for public policies and conduct nonpartisan voter engagement. So, only about 24% of the respondents in this survey trust that nonprofits will avoid partisan politics, which is something that concerns us because a lot of us know that the problems that we're currently working on, we have to have an advocacy arm parallel to actually providing programming if we want to achieve systemic change. There are also some clear pathways for nonprofits to increase public trust in the sector, and we'll talk a little bit about those. Now, I am a social scientist by training, so when I see these findings, I immediately want to know what's underneath them. So we disaggregated a bit of the data, and it's going to be really interesting as we sort of dig in. So let's talk a little bit about what we have found. Trust across institutions. At a high level, while trust in nonprofits have increased, trust decreased among other major entities, right? So when we think about the military, or small business, or even law enforcement, or corporate philanthropy, what we're seeing is a decrease in other institutional entities. When we compare, for example, nonprofits versus local government, nonprofits are trusted at more than twice the rate than local government is. So we have a tremendous responsibility as a sector. What is also notable is that there were significant dips in trust among almost all societal institutions. Small businesses, for example, saw a 12% decline in trust. So our sector is largely bucking the trend, which is something that we should be particularly proud of, is that while overall trust within society is declining, the only place that is not happening is within the social sector. Next. When we disaggregate across nonprofit subsectors, though, we see that Americans are clearly more trusting of certain kinds of nonprofits. Trust continued to remain high in human services, animals and wildlife, health and youth development nonprofits. However, though, the lowest amount of trust is in civic organizations, environmental advocacy, and civil rights. But I will note that you can see incremental increases across the board, indicating again that trust did in fact rebound broadly. Next. The public trusts nonprofits to make a positive difference on issues, on the pocketbook and quality of life issues that the public cares most about. Confidence is highest in nonprofits to make a difference. You can see how that especially breaks down on some of the most pressing issues like homelessness, poverty, and healthcare. And furthermore, you can see that people have more confidence in nonprofits than they do in business, government, and media. Next slide. There's also confidence in nonprofits to make a positive difference on the most diverse and polarizing issues. Our sector is perceived as a leader in making a positive difference when it comes to civil rights, race relations, climate change, and protecting democracy. Our sector is even seen as a leader tied with government in addressing crime. There are some of the most difficult challenges we face. Our data points to the fact that our nonprofits are not only trusted, but so necessary to our society. Next slide. As I shared earlier, trust in private foundations have increased in 2024. However, trust in corporate philanthropy and high net worth individuals remain much lower. I think this is important to unpack, especially from our point of view as an organization with nonprofits, corporate, and philanthropic members, right? So the independent sector, we deal with the whole of civil society. Public trust on both sides of the giving and doing equation really matters. For example, if people trust your organization to deliver critical services and you are up for a major grant from a group that has a more complicated relationship with your community served, what do you do? And this is a huge problem that faces nonprofit leaders every single day when they are trying to navigate the world of fundraising. And so there's a lot of work to do around this gap between the trust of nonprofits themselves to deliver high quality services and then actually who nonprofits actually fundraise and gather resources from to do their work. So we'll talk a little bit more about that. There are clear pathways for nonprofits to increase trust. For example, Americans who volunteer have a more favorable view of nonprofits. 79% of respondents said their previous volunteering experience made their views of nonprofit organizations more favorable. A majority of Americans say their trust in nonprofits would increase if it committed to a third-party standards for ethical operations and good governance practice. So what we found out was about 62% of our respondents would trust an organization more if it passed a course or certificate for ethics in its operations, which we thought was really interesting. 61% of respondents would increase their trust if the organization committed to a set of guidelines and ethical principles for its operations. Since 2007, independent sector has published the 33 Principles for Good Governance and Ethical Practices. We have this set of principles was created initially in 2007 because the sector was under public scrutiny for some bad actors, and so the 33 Principles for Good Governance actually created a set of principles for the sector to follow as it relates to fundraising, as it relates to advocacy work, right? And so this was very, very important to build trust with the sector, because this was our way of saying that the sector didn't need additional regulation, rather that the sector could monitor, manage itself. And so this is a very important piece of work that independent sector continues to hold. 2007, we first did this for the United States Congress, and then we disseminated, and we did this in partnership with nonprofits across the country. 2015, we updated the 33 Principles for Good Governance, because the reality in which nonprofits have to operate in constantly changes. And then more recently, in 2025, we're working on a third iteration of the 33 Principles for Good Governance. As you can imagine, we didn't have topics such as AI, such as privacy protection, or such clear mandates around racial equity and justice, right? So all of these new or updated ways in which we do our work all need to be incorporated into the updated version of 33 Principles. Next slide. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about volunteering. Something that I personally find compelling in today's world is the role that firsthand volunteering plays in building trust. Many of you will be familiar with the recent Surgeon General's report on the epidemic of loneliness in America, and it's something that we think about here a lot in independent sector. We have a growing divide that is seen and felt, especially by our younger people. Volunteering is a crucial way to not only build trust, but also build bridges and increase impact. So 79% of respondents said that their previous volunteering experience made their views of nonprofit organizations more favorable. 88% of respondents who have volunteered said that they would do it again. And again, this is important for us because when we think about where nonprofits recruit for board members, when they recruit for donors, individual donors, they are recruiting from their volunteer base. So volunteering is not only a way for Americans to deeply sort of roll up their sleeves and be in community in real time, but it's also a way for them to be deeply engaged with local nonprofits, and begin to build bridges, right, against across socioeconomic and racial lines. Next slide. Committing to a set of ethical principles can also build trust in nonprofits. Our sector has been doing this well for a very, very long time. Think about the seals of approval and credentials like from GuideStar, Better Business Bureau, etc. What's meaningful about this information to me is that we are seeing that being ethical and transparent matters to the public. But what else is interesting is that I see a divide between folks like us who work every day in the sector versus the general public. For example, there's a quote on the screen that is from a female Democrat who's only a little bit older than me, and she is looking for financial transparency within an organization. And my first reaction would be, like many of you all probably, is to say, hey, check out the 990, right? Because that is a public document that we have as a sector. But what we forget is that many people don't know how to do that. There is no sort of broad communication strategy for how regular Americans can seek out levels of transparency with their local nonprofit, right? So how do we actually communicate and talk to everyday Americans about good governance principles and our ability to show our financial and programmatic vulnerability? Next slide. So to increase trust, we need to increase the public's engagement with our sector. And to do that systematically, we need public policies that support engagement through volunteering, national service, and charitable giving. Right now, our nation's tax code tells only the wealthy that their charitable donations matter. Policymakers need to fix that. Our tax code values, for example, vehicle expenses for a business at 5 times the rate as for volunteering. And this feels very sort of simple, right? So if you are a for-profit, you can reimburse a mileage rate at 5 times the level if you were a nonprofit. And why this is important is for a lot of different reasons. We have nonprofits as members who take Americans to doctor appointments, right, that they can't attend, or that drive Americans to the polls to vote. Nonprofits are still the #1 way in which Americans engage, um, through the voting process. So this mileage reimbursement piece is huge. For example, some other additional policy priorities that we're looking at that help to promote a pro-social and pro volunteer engagement are a couple. So one is the child care tax credit. What we have found out is that our sector, as you can imagine, is about 2/3 women. And that even when we think about volunteers, when we think about who works in our nonprofit, and we do not have sort of a broad childcare tax credit to help ease the burden of childcare for our sector. As opposed to if I was a for-profit organization, there are tax credits available to help mitigate the cost of childcare for for-profit employees. So those are just some of the policy priorities that we are looking at. I'll give you another example. Nonprofits, we work with all Americans. And what we have found is that there is very little tax benefit to working with disabled Americans, or working with Americans who are recently incarcerated, or Americans who are veterans, right? And so there's very little sort of tax incentive to do that if you're a nonprofit. Um, and so for-profit businesses, they do have a tax incentive to help employ hard to reach Americans. And so one of the things that we're looking at in our tax and our legislative priorities is to be able to have tax parity, meaning that taxes that are on the books for-profit organizations, we're looking to be able to do that for nonprofits. And many of the new tax policies that we're pushing for, we think will help increase engagement among everyday Americans, which is still the bread and butter of many nonprofits. Next slide. One thing that I'm excited to share today with you all is our recent release of our state profiles that you can use to help make your case to policymakers. These state profiles can be essential tools for advocacy. Our profiles have comprehensive and reliable data. The dashboards you'll see provide the most recent available data on all 50 states, the District of Columbia, and the United States overall. These profiles also include real success stories because we know storytelling is still one of the most powerful tools to help sway policymakers. And these profiles are also easily printable. We want nonprofit leaders like yourself to be able to quickly print these off before talking with policymakers. So we're really excited to be able to share with you printable PDF, printable versions of the dashboard. So let's take a quick peek at California's state profile. You can see what sort of information these profiles can generate. This is a screenshot of our at the glance page, and you can see some of the figures generated include the number of nonprofits operating in the state, the number of jobs created, the number of volunteers and hours spent serving. Like Jeff said earlier, you know, you don't have to produce tons of research. Organizations like independent sector, this is what we're thinking about all day because we think about the sector holistically across this nation. And so we want to be able to share information like the state profiles with you all and be able to understand what else would be helpful with these profiles. So I encourage you all to take a look, to go deeper, to really play on this at the glance page and really test the utility of these state profile sheets. Next. So how can you stay involved? There's a couple of different ways. First, I will invite you all to download the 2024 Trust Report. Next, please sign up for independent sector emails. This is when you'll get the latest news on research, resources, events that are happening. Things like when our sector health report comes out, you'll be one of the first people to get it. Also, we would invite all of you to become a member of independent sector. If you are interested, please contact us at membership@independentsector.org. The other thing is attending our Independent Sector 2025 National Summit. It will be in Atlanta this year between October 27th and 29th. Again, this is an incredible opportunity to bring the entire charitable sector together. This is where we come and we build collective power among our sector. So this is everything from understanding sort of what the cutting edge research says around the health of the sector, around advocacy in the sector, and then also building and developing and strengthening coalitions. And then you can also reach me directly at Akilah W at independentsector.org. Once again, thank you, Jeff and Cal Nonprofits, for inviting me. I'm looking forward to our conversation and questions.
Thanks so much, Akilah. I'll bring Jeff back on.
Great. Well, thank you for that overview. I imagine some folks here are familiar with independent sector's work, but I'll just say that you do a lot of incredible things and you do in a lot of areas, and we're grateful to have you as partners and leaders. So thanks for spending the time here. Now I'm going to jump right into the weeds again. I'm just going to admit.
Do it.
We have, this question, as you said at the outset, is so important because it is arguably the primary currency we have, which is the trust of our larger communities. It seems to me that how we ask that question matters a lot. And in preparation for this, I know you and I talked last week and many other times, but in particular about this session, about who else is asking. And so I was combing through what we have here in California. Of course, we did a survey like this back in 2018 that we used, and we asked a lot of different questions, and we found that depending on what we asked, we got a different answer. There were two, and I think Robert has a slide of these two particular recent reports that I just use as samples. One is the one that the Lilly School did about trust in nonprofits and philanthropy, and the other is actually a regional one from California that our friends at the University of San Diego did. And even the variance there is huge. And so I'm just wondering your thoughts on that. There's so many shades of this question. Do you trust nonprofits? Do you believe that we're here in the public interest? Do you have experience with? How do you think through all the different pieces of those questions, and what's really most important to know?
So I think a couple of things, Jeff. I think one is that at some point doing a meta analysis would actually be really good. Like if, bringing together all the sort of social trust surveys to see if we see consistent lines through them, right? Or if we see some outliers. That's just a way to sort of check ourselves and be accountable to our research methods. But I also think too is that this whole idea of social trust is not new, but what is new, at least over the last 5 years, is that asking everyday Americans um, to think about their relationship to nonprofits is still a very new concept, right? This is our 5th year of doing this. We have 5 years of data. We feel good about having a baseline, but we also know that we have lived under some incredible times over the last 4 to 5 years. And so our ideals about trust, I don't know, have probably warped and shaped and changed. Um, but I think this is something that we need to continue to measure over time to see if we are starting to see any major shifts. What we can see is that we know the further we get away from COVID, um, or at least, in this last year, we've seen such a rebound in trust among nonprofits. Now, there's a lot of reasons we could think about this. We don't know whether or not there was something happening within society that allowed more Americans to interact with nonprofits, because one of the things we have seen is proximity matters, right? Proximity matters to Americans. I also want to make sure that people know this is a survey of 3,000 Americans. This is a randomized sample. This is not a convenient sample. This is a national randomized sample. And we really wanted to look at Democrats, we wanted to look at Republicans, we wanted to look at different regions of the country, we wanted to look at gender, we wanted to look at race. So we really wanted to make sure that we were capturing various Americans that have various perspectives in order to draw a conclusion around social trust.
So what you just mentioned, it was the next point I wanted to dig into a little bit. It's actually, I guess, two pieces. One is that there seem to be correlations with other kinds of social trust. Trust in institutions obviously has suffered as of late, as you mentioned, for a lot of reasons. And we get dragged down by that because nonprofits, in many cases, are arguably institutions, certainly larger ones that are familiar to folks. It reminds me a lot of that classic question that people get asked about Congress and their own representatives, like, oh yeah, Congress is terrible. I don't trust Congress. Oh yeah, but I like my congressperson. And so that's sort of proximity to what you're familiar with. And you said it earlier that familiarity seems to breed not contempt, but the opposite, about trust and generally support. If we're coming at it from that way, obviously volunteerism you mentioned, but what other things do you think we might do better to help connect with communities so that they do understand, feel closer, and then ultimately we would assume trust the nonprofit sector even more?
Well, I think a couple of things that we saw in the research. One is just being really transparent, right? Like being transparent about budgets, how financial decisions are made. And again, that's a lot of work for nonprofits. I want to just say I'm a nonprofit. I mean, I've been in this sector all my life, and we have a lot of just various entities we have to be accountable to. And this does become extra work for some nonprofits, but it's important work, and it's work that really helps to solidify trust. So publishing your financial statements, right? Having sort of community night where people can understand your work and your strategic plan, right? So those are things that at least we've gathered from the qualitative side of this that are important. The other thing that we did see is having a third party organization help certify nonprofits, like some certification, some some way to actually stamp that this nonprofit has been vetted, it is in good standing, it's, it works effectively. We found that credentialing does say something. It communicates to the general public, and that this nonprofit should be trusted, or that the public feels more trust when nonprofits sort of undergo that additional process. So I think those two things, we have found to be really important. I think where there's a struggle at, if I can be honest with you, what keeps me up at night about this is the interaction effect that nonprofits seem to have when we're working on advocacy and public policy issues. To your point, Jeff, that our social trust numbers sort of get dragged down by government. Yeah, it's an interaction effect. When we interact with certain institutions, we lose social trust. And we need to be able to interact with government, right? We get funded by government, and a lot of the social ills that we're working on, like government has to be at the table as a partner, for us to, sort of eradicate this work at its core. So I think that's the part we have to figure out as a sector, as to how do we communicate the need and value for public policy in a way that doesn't feel partisan? How do we bring volunteers into that sort of work more, the sort of advocacy, public policy work, so they can better buy into this? So I think those are the things that, that we sort of struggle with as a sector, but I do think we have some ways to build and strengthen trust.
I mentioned I was I'm on the road right now. I'm coming back from Sacramento because we were doing an experiment last night, which was a first time hosting our newly elected legislators, or at least as many as we could get to join us, to really connect them to some nonprofit leaders in the Capitol. And that's all about that familiarity and building trust and recognizing each other as partners. And frankly, selling a bit of what you just said, which is that yes, we are impacted by whom we interact with as far as our social trust goes, but it goes both ways. And so to help our legislators and our policymakers see us as helping them appear to be, but really be more connected to the communities that they are there to serve. So it's an obviously ongoing generational sort of work. I think there's some questions coming in, and I do want to weave these into our conversation. One, I think we can probably, and I hate to say this way, dispense with rather quickly, which is, thank you, Alex, for yours on the trust correlating with increases in funding. And the question is, it's good that people trust nonprofits, but does that mean more money is actually flowing into the nonprofit sector? The emergence of trust-based philanthropy. I would say no, that, there's no evidence that changes much with trust overall, and that, American giving tends to follow lines that are much more correlated to wealth dynamics and other things. You mentioned this in tax policy, but what do you have a view on that, about whether there's a correlation between dollars flowing into the sector philanthropically and this trust question?
So I'll answer it like this. I believe that, does it translate into more sort of foundation trust, like more sort of government contract trust? No. We haven't seen a clear correlation, or causation rather. But what we have seen is that as people volunteer more, serve on boards, they do become donors, right? And they write checks, right? Like a lot of individual donors have volunteered at the organizations in which they give, or have very close proximity of, they've been impacted by these organizations. So for the everyday American that, doesn't really think about these issues in their day, but they think about them when they are looking for swim classes for their kids, right? Like, we all have taken our kids to the local Y so they can learn how to swim. So when they're doing a fundraiser, we're going to give because it's impacted our kids. So that's what we're seeing from the data. And again, there's a lot to say about that, but we, as people volunteer more, as more social trust happens, we see people give individually.
I think it's a great way to parse that answer, because on a macro level, no, there doesn't seem to be a correlation. But on a personal, I mean, this goes back to sort of fundraising 101, that folks give what they know and who they trust, and leadership matters, and they give to people as much as causes or more. That's great. This then gets into something I was going to point out from the range of sort of random sample of studies that I know we talked about. There do seem to be differences around how a question gets asked. The other one is regional, and I'm wondering, you're looking at this from a national perspective. You approach your work that way. We're obviously a state level advocate, and we're looking from that perspective. The one of the two reports that I was looking at was one of these are rather common now, and there are plenty of regions where they do that. Certain coalitions will do it. And to Aaron, thank you for your comment question there, Aaron. Having coalitions survey their own region or their own constituencies around this question. It does seem that there are some regional differences, and I'm wondering if you've looked into that, or what that may say about regional, cultural, political, economic differences. Has that been looked at closely?
So I'm going to admit I'm a social scientist, so I'm always
already copped to that. So
I'm
good.
always interested in interacting variables, right? So I will say this: the one sort of individual dynamic that we see driving volunteerism is level of educational attainment. Like I would have thought it would have been more sort of regionalism, if I can be honest with you. And there's a lot of reasons why, like the role that religiosity plays in volunteerism could be one thing we can look at. But when we looked at the data, the one sort of salient factor was level of education. Now, I want to say what I think that is. It's not just because I think, oh, if you're college educated, you sort of know the intrinsic value of volunteerism, right? I think that's easy to say, but I would like for us to dig a little deeper on that. And I think what I would surmise is that in order to volunteer, you need time. You need time. You need space, right? And so it could be, and again, this is additional research, is that, people with college education tend to have levels of human capital. They tend to have jobs that give them sort of the flexibility that they need to volunteer in ways that people that don't have that sort of education are in jobs that don't allow them the sort of flexibility, right? So it could be both a human how people make decisions and how people place value on things, but it can also be sort of the structure of volunteerism, right? And people that are basically trying to survive every single day um, don't have the sort of spaciousness in the way that they need to deeply volunteer. So we don't know the answer to that, Jeff. But what we do know is what the differences we see in sort of volunteer rates have mostly been due to levels of college attainment.
Okay, that's interesting. And of course, that does vary with region. So you might see a correlation, and the actual causation may be much more complicated as we now I'm speaking social scientist terms. This is fun.
It could be. So but think about this. The world is different now. People, back in the day, people used to stay where they grew up at, right? So regionalism really, it had a lot more weight because people usually stayed. But today people are moving around, right? So even though somebody could be living in a particular region, they haven't sort of been curated in that region, right? So so anyway, regionalism could be a little harder to get at, like trying to figure out sort of the pureness of it.
Which brings us back to the connection and being connected to the community and the sector. So so let me go a different direction here. I do want to, the second part of Aaron's question was whether or not IS, independent sector, had tools to help if a coalition group wanted to do some surveying around questions like this. Are there tools to create a survey that you offer to members or others?
I think we could. I absolutely, well, at the very least, I think we're very open with our methodology, and we would have no problems with sharing our sort of methodology with anybody that's interested in doing this.
Great.
So we have a great team here. So yeah, absolutely. And be able to share with you how we've evolved over the last several years with these questions. So to your point, Jeff, like we think about every question, because we want to be able to ask questions that really get at what we're trying to measure. So what words to use, and that's why doing a qualitative analysis is also really important too. So for your folks out there that are interested in doing a trust survey, you know, quantitative is good. I mean, you can cover a lot of ground there, but if we want to know sort of what's behind the numbers and begin to paint a story, like doing a qualitative analysis would be great. And that's some of the data that's missing from this.
You hear that, folks? There's work to be done.
It's work to be done, especially regionally, right? Like for the folks in California, like being able to be able to have a qualitative conversation around social trust, especially now, especially especially with the sort of political environment we're in, and currently what's happened to California around environmental challenges. Um, I mean, I think it would be a really interesting piece of work.
And I'll just acknowledge there's some coalition partners we have in the San Francisco Bay Area who do some pretty good regular reporting on the health sector. I mentioned that our friends San Diego, University of San Diego, certainly in LA, Center for Nonprofit Management and others. So there are some good regional surveys that actually have some longitudinal data to offer. Oh, hey, there's that slide. So this is the one on center of the screen. There is the University of San Diego Nonprofit Institute. Actually, I'm on my way down there tonight to speak with that group, and they're releasing some of their new research as well for the San Diego region. So they've got some longitudinal. The other one up there, and I do want to talk a little bit about this, is the one coming out of the Lilly Family School. And this is of course the home of Giving USA and the things that all good fundraisers live by, or at least or study and look at. And they had a fascinating, for those of you who really want to dig into these are all publicly available surveys and studies and published reports. You can look at I think it's page 30. I don't have it in front of me right now, but it dug into another challenge, and you referenced this earlier. It's sort of it's transparency, but it's also just general understanding of the getting into the weeds around the work and what do people really know or understand. And I would bring this up in part right now because we're in this moment where this is part of the political conversation as well. If you think about either of the outgoing or incoming administrations at a federal level, this was part of the debate over the last several years of how well there's the messaging and there's the substance. And are they even on the same planet? And then secondly, how well are people talking about what's really happening behind the scenes? And the table that I'm referring to here talked about one particular piece of federal legislation and people's understanding about what it did or didn't do with respect to the nonprofit sector. And it was the Tax Cut and Jobs Act passed in 2017 that went into effect in 2018 that made some pretty radical changes to the way that the tax code treats philanthropy and giving to nonprofits. And the level of clarity that the people surveyed had around it was remarkably low. And it's not really remarkable if we think about how many people follow this stuff as a hobby. Guilty, obviously, but we're not the norm.
Nope.
And so that brings up a big challenge, because some of this policy that we're talking about to build trust, the things that we would need to do to help connect more people, give more people a stake, build some trust and familiarity in the nonprofit sector, is some wonky policy work. So communicating that, I imagine, from decades and decades of national experience would be difficult. Any thoughts on how we might, have you seen a good messaging campaign that speaks about wonky tax policy? Have you seen a good messaging campaign that helps people get into the weeds, but doesn't assume that they have studied this stuff their whole lives?
Jeff, let me answer your question directly. Not enough. I haven't seen enough of it. And I will also say that even before we talk about the wonky policy stuff, I think a lot of nonprofits need help communicating the impact that they're having on community, right? Like at the very least, people want to know that you're doing the right thing. You're using resources correctly, that you're helping the people you say you want to help, and getting nonprofits the communication resources they need to be able to tell their story in an impactful way, I think is important. Um, and so, you know, we definitely need to start working on the policy and wonky stuff, but I also think we have to bring Americans along, right? We have to first, you know, to be honest with you, the sector in a lot of ways can be largely invisible to people until they need it,
Right.
right? So how do we make the social sector more visible in people's lives, right? And how do we get everyday Americans to realize the deep value that it offers and then build trust? And so when we're talking about the policy and wonky stuff, we have built a history of trust with them to bring them along.
That's great. This has been a wonderful discussion, and we do have time for one more question that Alex has posted in the chat, and I'll read it off and let you all comment as you see fit. Alex asks, I've often thought that social capital is the biggest and most impactful thing in getting funding, grants, and donations. I wonder if there are any tools that has a social trust or social capital score. Have you heard from any funders using tools to determine how much they trust the organizations that they are funding?
Mm. Um, you know, we don't sort of explicitly, and Jeff, I also open this up to you too. I don't know if we explicitly talk about that, like how much I trust this organization, right? Like that, I'm not saying that's bad language. I'm just saying that's not historically how we've sort of thought about nonprofits. Like we go to really tactical things. And then in terms of trust, we start talking about the competency level of sort of leaders. But we don't sort of give foundations. I mean, we haven't historically given them the tools to sort of talk about social trust as it relates to their relationship with nonprofits. Um, I think that is a very interesting proposal. I think you can open up a lot of interesting and tough conversations around how do people build trust? What does it look like? How do people garner it? Um, so yeah, anyway, those are my sort of initial thoughts.
Yeah. I would agree. I guess I will admit to having a real reaction to that notion.
Yeah.
I think we've had some really rough experiences in the sector of entities that honestly have no business weighing in on their opinions of the sector, branding themselves as a go-to. And I'm going to call out the one that I know I'm going to call out, which is Charity Navigator. I think it's been an incredibly destructive thing for the sector because what they've done is essentially miseducate a generation of donors that the less you spend on your people, your infrastructure, and your organization, the better you are as a nonprofit. And that, that's been very much serving the underinvestment in the sector because it's grading business sector, in this case, the nonprofit sector, on how poorly it invests in its own people, resources, and infrastructure. So I think it can easily go awry if we're asking, if we're grading from an external third party. I think I will give the example of Candid. And I do think that the emergence of the transparency scores that they give are actually potentially a really positive thing because they're simply offering a grading essentially on how much do you share, how open are you, how transparent are you beyond the required 990 filings and such. So I think it's interesting. I do think that in the sense that it's referring to funders, that's a different question, which is, do we want to engage with funders more specifically on trust? I mean, trust-based philanthropy is simply a new brand of a very old idea, which is generally moving the resources and trusting the people on the ground who know the work best to lead and do it as they see fit. And I very much a supporter of that notion. But even at its peak in the pandemic, when it probably got the most traction and interest, it was still a small minority of funders that really operated in that sense. So to Alex's question, I think it's a great idea if we wanted to go the right way. I just think there's some real pitfalls of that going off the rails and becoming another sort of judgment from the outside. May or may not be based in any understanding of how the work happens. So
Always that question of overhead, isn't it?
well, then there's that.
In any case, thank you so much Dr. Watkins and Jeff for joining us for this conversation. I think this was a particularly engaging discussion that showed insight into the different areas and ways that our communities trust nonprofits and the philanthropic sector, and the ways that we can also engage and build that trust in our societies. So I thank you both for joining us and really appreciate the work that independent sector has done in this space. The resources that Jeff mentioned, I will also include in our follow-up email, as well as all of the resources that Dr. Watkins has mentioned during our conversation. So once again, I want to thank you both for joining us and look forward to having you join us again in some upcoming webinars. And those upcoming webinars are right here for us to feature. On Thursday, next week, on the 30th, we have a really important webinar that I want to highlight called Preparing the Nonprofit Sector for Trump 2.0, Advocacy Strategies and Lessons from HR 9495. And Thursday, February 13th, Ask a Nonprofit Lawyer. And this will be helping you navigate legal issues with confidence. So thank you so much, everyone, for attending. We're always happy to have you join us, and we look forward to seeing you at future nonprofit, Cal nonprofit education events. So Jeff, Akilah, thanks so much again. Everyone who joined, we look forward to seeing you. Have a great afternoon and take care.